Hey everyone. So I felt the need to make a video to encourage all my brothers and sisters out there who are still hoping in the blessed hope, which is the pre-tribulation rapture of the church. There have been many comments, many scoffers, mockers, and deniers of a pre-tribulation rapture, and I just felt the need to defend it. It's always been something that the Lord has allowed me to hold on to, a conviction that I had that through the plain reading of Scripture, we are going to be taken out of the tribulation. A lot of the confusion comes from believers who don't understand the purpose of the tribulation, don't understand dispensations, and confuse Israel and the church. So I want to venture to give you 7 reasons why the church will indeed be raptured before the tribulation. Number 1, the church is not mentioned in Revelation 6 through 18 as being on earth. Now, the common New Testament term for church is ecclesia, and it's used 19 times in Revelation 1 through 3, a section that deals with the historical church of the first century toward the end of the apostle's life, the Apostle John's life. However, church is then only used once more in the 22nd chapter of Revelation, and its use is at the very end, when John returns to addressing the first century church. Most interesting is the fact that nowhere during the period of Daniel's 70th week is the term for church used for believers on earth. It is unexpected that John would shift from detailed instruction for the church to complete silence about the church in the subsequent 13 chapters, if in fact the church did continue into the tribulation. If the church will experience the tribulation of Daniel's 70th week, then surely the most detailed study of tribulation events would include an account of the church's role, but it does not. The only timing of the rapture that would account for this frequent mention of church in Revelation 1 through 3 and the total absence of church on earth until Revelation 22 is a pre-tribulation rapture, which will relocate the church from earth to heaven prior to Daniel's 70th week. Now, Revelation 12 also speaks of the entire tribulation period. It gives like a mini synopsis, and because the woman who gave birth to the male child is Israel, then the tribulation period focuses on the nation of Israel, not the church. Now, how could this be? Because a pre-tribulation rapture has removed the church from the earth prior to Daniel's 70th week. Number 2, the rapture is rendered inconsequential if it is a post-trib rapture. First, if God miraculously preserves the church through the tribulation, why have a rapture? If it is to avoid the wrath of God at Armageddon, then why would God not continue to protect the saints on earth, just as he protected Israel from the wrath he poured out on Pharaoh in Egypt? If the purpose of the rapture is for living saints to avoid Armageddon, why also resurrect the saints who are already immune at the same time? Second, if the rapture will take place in connection with the Lord's post-tribulation coming, the separation from the sheep and goats will be redundant. Separation will have taken place in the very act of the rapture. Third, if all tribulation believers are raptured and glorified just prior to the inauguration of the millennial kingdom, who then will populate and propagate the kingdom? The scriptures indicate that the living unbelievers will be judged at the end of the tribulation and removed from the earth, according to Matthew 13. Yet they also teach that children will be born to believers during the millennium, and that these children will be capable of sin, according to Isaiah 65 and Revelation 20. This will not be possible if all believers on earth have been glorified through a post-trib rapture. Fourth, the post-trib rapture of the church being raptured and then immediately brought back to earth leaves no time for the bema seat or the judgment seat of Christ to occur, according to 1 Corinthians chapter 3. nor for the marriage supper of the Lamb talked about in Revelation 19, verses 6 through 10. Thus, it can be concluded that a post-trib rapture is not in line with the sheep and goat nation judgment, and in fact eliminates two critical end-time events. A pre-tribulation rapture avoids all of these difficulties. Excuse me. Number 3. Nowhere does Paul's epistles give preparatory warnings of an impending tribulation for church-age believers. God's instructions to the church through the epistles contain a variety of warnings, but never do they warn believers to prepare for entering and enduring the tribulation of Daniel's 70th week. They warn vigorously about coming error and false prophets. They warn against ungodly living. They even admonish believers to endure in the midst of present tribulation. However, there is absolute silence on preparing the church for any kind of tribulation like that found in Revelation 6 through 18. It is incongruous, then, that the scriptures would be silent about such a traumatic change for the church. If any time of the rapture other than a pre-tribulation were true, one would expect the epistles to teach the reality of the church in the tribulation, the purpose of the church in the tribulation, and the conduct of the church in the tribulation. However, there is no teaching whatsoever. Only a pre-tribulation rapture explains the silence. Number 4. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 13 through 18 demands a pre-tribulation rapture. Now, suppose hypothetically that some other rapture timing besides pre-tribulation is true. What would one expect to find in 1 Thessalonians 4? How does this compare with what is actually observed? First, one would expect the Thessalonians to be joyous over the fact that the loved ones are at home with the Lord and will not have to endure the horrors of the tribulation. But the Thessalonians are actually grieving because they fear their loved ones have missed the rapture. Only a pre-tribulation rapture accounts for this grief. Secondly, one would expect the Thessalonians to be grieving over their own impending trial rather than grieving over loved ones. Furthermore, they would be inquisitive about their own future doom. But the Thessalonians have no fears or questions about the coming tribulation. Third, one would expect Paul, even in the absence of interest or questions by the Thessalonians, to have provided instructions and exhortation for such a supreme test, which would make their present tribulation seem microscopic in comparison. But not one indication of any impending tribulation of this sort appears in the text. 1 Thessalonians 4 fits only the model of a pre-trib rapture. It is incompatible with any other time for the rapture. Number 5. John 14, 1 through 3 parallels 1 Thessalonians 4. John 14 refers to Christ's second coming. It is not a promise to all believers that they shall go to him at death. It does refer to the rapture of the church. Notice the close parallel between the promises of John 14 and 1 Thessalonians 4. First, the promise of a presence with Christ, that where I am, there you may be also, and thus we shall always be with the Lord, 1 Thessalonians 4. Second, the promise of comfort, let not your heart be troubled, John 14:1, and therefore comfort one another with these words, 1 Thessalonians 4:18. Jesus instructed the disciples that he was going to his Father's house to prepare a place for them. He promised that he would return and receive them so that they could be with him where he was. The phrase, wherever I am, while implying continued presence in general, here means presence in heaven in particular. The Lord told the Pharisees in John 7, where I am, you cannot come. He was not talking about his then present abode on earth, but rather his resurrected presence at the right hand of the Father. In John 14:3, where I am, must mean in heaven, or the intent of John 14 would be meaningless. A post-tribulation rapture demands that the saints meet Christ in the air and immediately descend to earth without experiencing what the Lord promised in John 14. Since John 14 refers to the rapture, Only a pre-tribulation rapture satisfies the language of John 14 and allows raptured saints to dwell for a meaningful time with Christ in his Father's house. Number 6, the nature of events at Christ's post-tribulation rapture coming differs from that of the rapture itself. Now, if one compares what happens at the rapture in 1 Thessalonians 4 and 1 Corinthians 15 with what happens in the final events of Christ's second coming in Matthew 24 through 25, at least 8 differences are observable. These differences demand that the rapture occur at a time significantly different from that of the final event of Christ's second coming. Let's look at these. Number 1, at the rapture, Christ comes in the air and returns to heaven. But at the final event of the second coming, Christ comes to the earth to dwell and reign, Matthew 25. At the rapture, Christ gathers his own, but at the final event of the second coming, angels gather the elect. At the rapture, Christ comes to reward, but at the final event of the second coming, Christ comes to judge. At the rapture, resurrection is prominent, but at the final event of the second coming, resurrection is not mentioned. Excuse me. At the rapture, believers depart the earth, but at the final event of the second coming, unbelievers are taken away from the earth. At the rapture, unbelievers remain on earth, but at the final event of the second coming, believers remain on earth. At the rapture, there is no mention of establishing Christ's kingdom on earth, but at the final event of the second coming, Christ has come to set up his kingdom on earth. And finally, at the rapture, believers will receive glorified bodies, but at the final event of the second coming, no one receives glorified bodies. Finally, the rapture is not mentioned in either of the most detailed second coming texts, Matthew 24 and Revelation 19. This is to be expected in light of the observation above, because the pre-tribulation rapture will have occurred 7 years earlier